Welcome. Thanks for joining to the strategy session. I am Jeff Timmer. I am a last-minute fill-in for my friend Stuart Stevens, here with my colleague and friend Joe Trippi. Our guest this evening is a historian of gender, faith, and politics, and author of New York Times best-selling Jesus and John Wayne, and a new gospel for women in the forthcoming book, Live, Laugh, Love. If you don't already, you should definitely subscribe to her newsletter, Du Mez Connections. Please welcome Kristin Du Mez.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Kristin, we certainly find ourselves in interesting times, as they say. Your field of study, we've had others on this show and other things that we've been affiliated with separately, that talking about authoritarianism, extremism, radicalism. Why don't you tell us how you came to this field of study, where we're at today, how this your book, Jesus and John Wayne, is so particularly poignant and relevant to the moment we find ourselves in. I guess I'll leave it there and then just say, I'll let you answer all these questions.
Yeah, so Jesus and John Wayne is a history of white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And I'm a cultural historian, so I went through 75 years of evangelical history with a real focus on evangelical popular culture, popular devotionals, movies, and contemporary Christian music, sermons, really the kind of lived religion that ordinary evangelicals were consuming, on teachings about family, about gender, how to be a Christian wife, how to raise your kids, and very mainstream evangelicalism. But as I was studying the source material, I was frequently confronted with the fact that many of the teachings seemed, while mainstream, also rather extremist, particularly in terms of conceptions of hierarchy, of order, of obedience and submission. This is gendered hierarchy. Sometimes in more extreme spaces, it's racial hierarchy, right? And it was really shocking when I went back to that source material and saw just how important authority was, this hierarchical authority, which frankly, when I was first researching, I didn't even know what to do with that because it seemed authoritarian, or at least proto-authoritarian. And so I went on and I wrote the book of the long history of this very militant conception of masculinity inside evangelical spaces as it's linked to Christian nationalism, of asserting power, reclaiming a kind of Christian America. And I published that as Jesus and John Wayne. And sadly, it makes a whole lot of sense of what we're seeing and of what we're continuing to see. So I would say one of the real things that I'm keeping an eye on is what is the connection between this kind of mainstream evangelical culture and the more extremist and authoritarian or proto-authoritarian elements.
We hear so often now that it seems like we've become immune to it, kind of like the fable of the frog in the water that slowly gets hotter. This rhetoric, this violent centric rhetoric on the political right. Donald Trump is the most visible at the apex of the examples. Just recently, we've spent, now we're shortly into this week, it's only Tuesday, but we've spent the last 3 or 4 days, national news cycles, talking about what bloodbath means. That kind of, when you're talking about, this toxic masculinity and this hierarchical, demeaning, male-centric. It really is. I think a great example, and it's this constant example. And there's this excuse that's given to just, those words don't mean. It's really talking about the auto industry. I guess tell us your thoughts on that instance, this rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
What should we really be? What's the lens we should be looking at this through?
No, it is really tricky, right? And particularly when you get into Christian spaces, you have this kind of warfare language, vocabulary that is biblical. It's in the Bible. And you can find in the book of Revelation a kind of warrior Jesus, savior who wields a bloody sword. And you can find, other kind of militaristic language, the armor of God, for example. But that's not a kind of physical armor, and it's not a call to war necessarily. It can be interpreted in a spiritual sense. So you put on the belt of righteousness and truth, and it's kind of metaphorical, right? And so it's tricky because they'll use this language, and many Christians do mean it in a metaphorical sense. But what I saw when I was looking at the extremely popular books on evangelical masculinity, so in the early 2000s is when I first started paying attention to these books. And one of the famous ones was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. Now, Eldredge wasn't calling Christians to take up arms by any stretch, but he was holding up this militant ideal. So he said, God is a warrior God, and men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight. Now, again, is that metaphorical or is that real? And in the early 2000s, I saw how white evangelicals just topped the charts on all sorts of surveys in terms of support for war, support for the Iraq war in particular, condoning the use of torture, a support for preemptive war, right? All of these statistics, white evangelicals topped the charts. And so I started asking, what might one of these things have to do with the other? It's not necessarily a direct link, but it does kind of build a sense of an ideal, a sense of what is possible, and it certainly removes kind of inhibitions, and it sets up an ideal for what a true leader is and what a true leader will do. And so in the book, in Jesus and John Wayne, I connect that language around evangelical manhood, this warrior ideal. I mean, they loved William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, right? That's their kind of ideal Christian man, not the Jesus of the Gospels. And so I connect that to see how that then is used to justify this militant, aggressive posture to fight all the wars, including the wars against the internal enemies, even especially against those enemies, liberals, feminists, right, Democrats, right? And if you have that context, then suddenly Donald Trump makes a whole lot of sense. The media was asking over and over again, still asks, how can they support white evangelical support a man like Donald Trump, right? He's not very Christian. No, but he embodies this kind of ruthless masculinity, whether it's your type or not, no restraints, no particular Christian virtue, but that's what makes him such a great leader for this urgent moment. He's the warrior who will lead the charge, and he presents himself as such. They call him their ultimate fighting champion.
So that links up to Proud Boys, Stand By and Stand Back, or Stand Back and Stand By, to his announcement happening at Waco. I mean, it's this sort of the good people on both sides. It's like this, he's talking to them, yes, in a way that they get, and the rest of us are sort of is that sort of the power of his rhetoric and how he uses it?
Yeah, there's always plausible deniability, right? That's not what I meant, right? Just enough. So you're flirting with it, which means some elements of his base can take it quite literally. I think that Bloodbath comment was a great example, and others can roll their eyes, and castigate the media and the liberals for taking things too far. That's totally not what he meant. And look at you all, and it's really a way to kind of weaponize the language in a twofold strategy. First you're inciting the base, at least a certain portion of the base, and then you're also using it to detract from those who would oppose any move towards violence or dropping of inhibitions.
The question I've got is the other side of this, though, and I don't quite explain this to me. Is Revelations is also full of, beware of the false prophet. You'll know the beast because his followers will wear his mark on their foreheads. I mean, there should be, some sort of counter mythology or whatever you want to call it that could make these people question whether they're following the real guy or not. But we never do that. I haven't seen anybody do that. And would it work anyway if somebody tried, in your view?
It would not. It would not. So there's a lot of Bible verses that you could pull here, not just from Revelation. Right. Like I said, the whole Jesus story kind of central to the Christian faith. All sorts of teachings about turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, welcoming the stranger, the foreigner. Right? There's a lot of Bible verses that you can work with to counter this ideology, but this really isn't about the Bible. I mean, the Bible is certainly used, but you can't use the Bible or theology internally to disrupt these values, this ideology, right? You're going to just run up against it. So the Bible is used to justify this framework, but there's really no space for, hey, let's open the Bible together. Let's talk theology. Let's talk interpretation here. A whole host of books on Revelation are out there and Bible studies that say, that's not actually how to best interpret it with the tools that we have. No, those are going nowhere. And if you listen to the language of these folks on the right and Christian nationalists, if you will, some who self-identify, others who get put in that category, you don't hear much about Jesus at all. Right? Jesus doesn't really fit, except the Jesus of Revelation, this kind of warrior Jesus. And again, there's blood, there's violence, and then back to here's our agenda.
So is that also why they have clung immediately to the Putin thing? I mean, when Trump leads on that, is it the same exact kind of thing? Putin has become their image of the the powerful, the Superman.
Yeah. So he's definitely an image of a strongman, and that was one of the more surprising things that I saw in my research, right? Because if you know the history of conservative evangelicalism, the Cold War is such an important context for the emergence of the kind of political identity of modern evangelicals, and so Russia, the enemy, the Soviet Union and communism and all of that. And, I realize, Russia has changed and we've got Putin now and it's not communist, but I'd expected a little bit more residue, maybe residual, animosity towards, these are the bad guys. And it was shocking to see how quickly Putin in particular became a kind of hero, particularly during the Obama administration, right? Because they didn't like Obama for all the reasons. And then they held up Putin as this guy is a real leader. So they liked his power. They liked his anti-LGBTQ agenda. They liked his, traditionalism. They really liked how he knew how to wield power.
I was recently at a conference and I was interviewed by a reporter from a French newspaper. And he was talking about the rise of right-wing extremism in Western democracies, this kind of lurch toward authoritarianism that we're seeing. But he asked me an interesting question that I hadn't heard asked this way before. And it was effective. I'll just boil it down. It's like, why does it seem different in the United States versus these other Western democracies? Why does it seem more potent, more culturally ingrained? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not the cultural, scientist here. I'm not you. But yeah. I kind of stumbled for a second, and I thought, well, it seems like it's because of the religion. It's because it's wrapped and cloaked in this facade of religion that's not really religion. And that seems to be, the basic premise here. And it's that religion is so prevalent in our culture, and especially on the right side of our politics. This religiosity on your sleeve is part of your political identity that has arisen since Jerry Falwell was welcomed into the fold by Ronald Reagan, and God told Pat Robertson to run for president. It has been kind of at the forefront. Is our politics have moved from secular policy issues to theological issues being fought in the secular policy arena.
Yeah, no, I like the way you frame that. I just reached over here for a brand new book, or new in English translation. It's The Christian Right in Europe, by Jonathan Lomascalo. And it is a kind of comprehensive book, chapters on, I think, like 17 different countries, and a comparative analysis. But I think you're exactly right in terms of why things are different here. And it is because we have a long, long history now. I mean, I guess you could go back to Tocqueville in the 19th century and talk about our particular, religiosity and what that means. But certainly in the last half century or more, the role of the Christian right, which is not just this deep religiosity. In fact, we could question how deep that religiosity goes, but organized, extremely well organized. And that is incredibly important to recognize. You mentioned Jerry Falwell, the moral majority. We could talk about the Council for National Policy, right? Often kind of beneath the radar of a lot of reporters, and they like to keep it that way. But you have this scaffolding throughout the religious right that has been around now for decades, generations. The networks that bring together major donors, right? Very powerful donors, with religious leaders, with political leaders. And they meet behind closed doors. Again, they like to keep, some of these guys like the attention. A lot of them prefer to just wield the power behind the scenes. And then they are connected to evangelical organizations like Family Research Council, right, connected to Focus on the Family, and these other more public-facing, popular organizations that reach hundreds of millions of ordinary evangelicals and beyond evangelicalism.
Right.
We could talk Christian radio too, right? Salem Radio, very, very influential in these spaces. So what you have is this incredible scaffolding, this network that goes back decades, and that is just ready and can be turned in any number of directions at a moment's notice. And that's been with us for a very long time, and it's still with us today, and it's growing.
And no one built anything on the other side of pro-democracy or anything. It was no organization exists like that, which also explains, I think, why the evangelicals are not that big a group in the country. I mean, in terms of their voting percentages, but that organizational basis that then fans out to white supremacists who may not consider themselves evangelicals. I mean, but that's been tied into the coalition that's reached through these networks that's what gets it close to like 45-50% of people who may vote for Trump, right?
Exactly. Yeah, evangelicals are not majority of the population, certainly, and the numbers fluctuate depending on how the survey questions are formulated. We're looking maybe 14-15% of voters. But then within the Republican Party, right, that's where we see them really wielding their power. And then the coalitions. And what we see here is, conservative white evangelicals, conservative Catholics, secular conservatives, all finding common cause here, right? And what has happened in recent years, as you well know, is the power of the Christian right and this kind of conservative strand within the Republican Party has really, taken hold with the help of Trump, putting Trump in there and growing in strength, so that the kind of old school Republicans who for generations kind of kept him in check, right? The more, the kind of Chamber of Commerce conservatives, if you will, right? They're no longer there keeping him in check.
They've been purged. And
Absolutely.
So I want to take the last 10 minutes or so, at least move it towards the 2025 agenda, because I think too many people don't have any real understanding of what that is, how it will change people's lives, and why this coalition is so important to bring it to the fore.
Yeah.
So maybe, Kristin, if you could sort of give us a quick overview of that, and then some follow-up questions.
Sure. Yeah. So that scaffolding I was talking about, right? We're seeing it really come together in a powerful and frightening way, frankly, if you don't share this agenda. So Project 2025 is a plan produced by the Heritage Foundation. So these guys are behind it, but also endorsed by or in cooperation with, now they're up to over 100 conservative organizations, right? So like Alliance Defending Freedom, Claremont, it's kind of a who's who, Family Research Council, right? A who's who of these, many of them old and venerable conservative networks, organizations. They're all coming together now. And Project 2025 is a plan for what to do when Trump wins again. So as soon as he takes office, they recognize that for all of his achievements while in office the first time around, right, he was limited in some ways, particularly by the federal bureaucracy, including by some of his own appointees. And so they want to now purge the federal bureaucracy, all of the departments, right, all of them, and only staff them with Trump loyalists. And so this is a huge plan. It's like several hundred pages of kind of the agenda for the entire breadth of our government. And it is, so it's the plan, the policy agenda, right there for everybody to see. Most of it, I've heard some of it is kind of kept under wraps still. They don't want to scare us too much. A lot of it is there for everybody to see. And they have a kind of educational training, online training, so that you can kind of get certified and vetted so that you are ready to go to be slotted into one of these positions. And the whole plan is to purge the federal government, staff it with loyalists, and carry forward Trump's agenda, no guardrails, and really transform this country from top to bottom.
And what are some of the things that that we know they're talking about doing? I mean, in terms of
Whole spectrum, family values, right? So a lot of these traditional organizations are, pro-family values. So they're talking about, getting rid of all gender ideology, LGBTQ rights, education, like purging that all from schools, getting the government out of school. So this is into kind of private education, but especially parental authority over education, these sorts of things, really just the traditional conservative Christian agenda, but now actually having the means by which to implement them across the government.
Look at I think that the trap fall into, and I think that so much of the traditional political media seems to have fallen into this, is that, well, Trump, for all of his political success or almost invincibility that nothing seems to ever ding him, he's this non-strategic, incapable of planning, kind of buffoonish individual. This is the part that doesn't get enough attention, that there's this very capable, sinister people who are very good at organizing, planning, executing, that are planning that next step. Trump is their vessel to the Stephen Millers, the Steve Bannons, the visible, people on the, to most of our viewers. And I'm sure
don't
there's,
don't leave out Putin.
but yeah, but
Yeah, but I mean,
but I'm talking about within the executing this and operationalizing this within the U.S. government. There's they are, this is the real deep state plan. This is
exactly. I talked to the LGBTQ family values. Those are almost that's very important, and I think for voters to be aware of. But it goes so much deeper, kind of structurally, right? So in there is on day one, invoking the Insurrection Act to ban protests, that sort of thing. Also, not spending money that Congress has already allotted on any programs that they deem, contradict their plan. And so they're really going structural here too, repealing different government regulations, taking over the Department of Justice, right? And using that to forward the Trump agenda. Basically take that and apply that to every department of government, and then imagine what would Trump like to do with it. And chances are that's in these 800 pages. But you're right. They have. So Trump himself, not an organizational genius. Maybe he is a genius of other sorts, in terms of propaganda and, right. This kind of charismatic leadership that works for, half the country and doesn't for the rest of us. But you're exactly right. So these are the folks. Now, I should say that Trump has not officially endorsed Project 2025. But he did recently in his speech to the national religion broadcasters. I don't know if you caught that at all. There are some memorable moments there. I recommend just listening to that whole speech. The video is available, and he will lay out his agenda for what he promises to do for Christians. And there's a pretty close overlap there between what he's promising and what we see in Project 2025 laid out in detail.
Well, Kristin, in the few minutes we have left here, I just saw one of the viewers ask a question, and the way I'm going to interpret this, Maxine asked, kind of effectively, what's next? Okay, let's assume that democracy survives this election. Let's say Donald Trump doesn't win, but we're still at a very dangerous place not just in our politics, but our culture. How does this, it's not just losing the election isn't going to end this. How do we go on from here? Give us some hope.
Oh, I hate that question. I'm a historian. Honestly, first I'll go to history, 20th century history, and say we are in a perilous time, because if you look at, when democracies fall or how democracies die, if you will, what you see is often a lot of close calls. Right. And we made it through that one, or the democracy still stands until it doesn't. Right. And so we already have that sense of the last several elections, each one the most important election of our lifetime. Right. And it's true. And each subsequent one is. How many more times can we kind of dodge a bullet, I think is a fair question. But that's not very hopeful. I think it is very important if obviously, if Trump is defeated, that is one of the things I think that, a resounding electoral defeat in multiple is one thing that could kind of cleanse the system, but it will take time. The problem is we've already seen Trump's game plan, right, which is election denial. And so when I've been talking with political strategists, I'm guessing you're probably hearing some of the same things. There are grave concerns about violence on Election Day and in the days to follow. And so a win isn't necessarily going to do it anymore. And what will fix this? Nothing in the short term that I can think of. And I hate to say the only kind of quick fix will come from things getting much worse before they get better. But hopefully we can hold on and then look for ways to restore faith in democracy, to build trust. And that is, again, there's no quick fix here. And I think that has to happen person to person as much as through, kind of policy and leadership. And it's something that we all have to look for how we can do that in our own communities. Because on the ground, this polarization is not ripping many communities apart in the same way as it is on the national level. So I think we really have to work with our neighbors to say, how can we re-stabilize our country?
Well, we are Resolute Square. This is the strategy session. I'm Jeff Timmer. This is Joe Trippi joining us tonight. Thank you, author, historian, professor Kristin Du Mez. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.